Thank you, Mark. Thanks to Dean Mulgridge for inviting me. So first, I need to apologize for my pretentious title. I mean, I'm super proud of it, but I'm also a little bit ashamed of it. But it was a kind of an experiment in crafting the most academic title for a talk about my work that I could. And I got to say that I typically, when I give this talk, I only show the work of other artists. I only show other photographers who are much more well-known than I am. Partway through crafting the talk and kind of boring myself with something that I've done a few times, I decided, you know what? Take this opportunity to mostly talk about what I've done for the last 25 years, which I think has some purchase with the topic. It's okay if you walk out now if you came to hear that. I'm going to talk obliquely about that, but I'm mostly going to talk about what I have done. And before I start, I haven't started, in case you're timing. Are you timing me and going to give me a sign? Okay. Well, once I go extemporaneous, it could just go. So maybe it. Good. So I want to make a photograph of you. This is something I lifted from my friend Tim Davis, who teaches at Bard. He photographs the audiences when he lectures, and now we're kind of in a competition to see who can make more and better photographs of our audiences. So sit tight and do whatever you do when someone says, look at the camera. And I think I have all of you. Yeah. That was it. Thank you. It's more than just a camera, it's also a prop that will come back later in the talk. But for now, it goes over here. I'll Photoshop some more in, up there. Okay, so, at this moment when images are so ubiquitous, when everyone's a photographer, everyone's a curator, everyone's a collector, photography, what do I mean by photography is dead? Well, I mean that those essential things that we used to define the medium, such as lenses gather light reflected off of objects in the world, projected onto some sensing surface like film or a digital sensor, even those very things that define the medium are shifting and changing, and yet we're still calling these things photographs. And I'm talking mostly about images that are meant not to be seen by human eyes, but machine vision, optical recognition systems for license plates, facial recognition software. These are digital computing imagery systems that are speaking to other computers for the most part, and our judgments don't necessarily apply. So I'm not going to talk too much about that stuff because I want to cut to what I have done. And I'm going to go back to 1992, fresh out of graduate school at Hunter College. I undertook a project that I thought was going to lend visual, sort of poetic form to some of the more troubling aspects of the intelligence community's behavior at the time, and specifically the CIA, and in particular, the clandestine services, and within the clandestine services, the Office of Technical Services. Basically James Bond's Q, if rather than inviting James Bond into a room where there were a lot of weapons, if Q just dropped pamphlets on a beachhead from a C-130 to instruct third world guerrillas how to overthrow their own governments. So this was initially planned to be an exhibition of prints, and it was. And it showed in a lot of venues. But it was really at its most effective as an impersonation project in 1996 or so when this thing called the internet got my attention as a platform for distribution of imagery, and I could really easily impersonate the actual CIA and their museum that didn't exist. It turns out 20 years later exactly, the CIA did create an online museum. And I'll show you some images from that. This is the tea kettle incendiary device or booby trap. So what I'm doing here is working directly from documentary sources. These two drawings are from a CIA manual called Field Expedient Improvised incendiary devices used to train operatives. So I'd take these terrible drawings and make an object in the studio. This is pre-Photoshop. I don't know if I need to point that out, or if it matters, because it doesn't, because later I use Photoshop. So I'm actually having to physically make this cartoonish cutaway view. This was always popular with kids when I give lectures. This is called the tactical briefcase. This one's not based on a drawing, it's based only on a description from a case officer who in Angola who described a story of being given one of these devices and then not being able to figure out how to use it, and then accidentally went off in a bar, and hilarity ensued. This is a lighter booby trap, and this is the drawing from which the lighter booby trap made. So what I'm doing here is, the way I paid for grad school is I was a commercial photographer in New York City, working in a pretty busy studio as an assistant, as what they call a first assistant, which means I didn't necessarily make coffee. I actually used the camera occasionally. And we worked for, did ads that you've seen that you didn't notice for like Revlon, Almay, Clinique, Swatch, on and on and on. And it was called Tabletop. There was an entire block in New York City on 23rd Street that all did tabletop photography. There was another block that did humans and models, and there was a block for hands, and there was a block for food. But we were all tabletop, which was jewelry, cosmetics, and personal effects. So this is 20 years later, the CIA's museum, online museum, and I decided not to sue them because, you know, I stole from them to make mine. But their lighting convention and display mode is a little familiar here, right? This is a combination of two designs. It's a picket delay, what's called a picket fence delay of matches. And I had a student only this semester tell me that cigarettes are no longer reliable fuses for weapons because they're designed now to extinguish themselves, which is good. But back in the day, when the smell of a cigarette would not alert authorities, this would be an effective fuse to light up plastic explosive. This is one of the only models I ever made that survived, meaning these things are produced as objects, but they're produced only for one view. For a camera like that, a 4x5 view camera, and if you move your head and look around the camera, the illusion is shattered. You see the wire that's holding the thing, you see the hot glue, you see all the things that are there to kind of make the illusion work, but only if I grab your ears and hold your head in just the right place. This object didn't fall apart when I took it off set, so I was able to actually sell it. As art, not as a weapon. And that's the drawing that it's based on. So yeah, I did a couple of dozen of these things. At one moment in '96, if you Googled CIA, the first thing that came up was the Central Intelligence Agency, and the second hit was the Central Intelligence Museum. So I got interviewed by a lot of magazines, and a lot of people mistook me for intelligence personnel, which was fun, but it also kind of made me paranoid, obviously. So I started to wonder, well, what does that look like? What does the surveillance that I'm surely under, what does it look like? So I just made it. This is called the Nadar 2000. This is, on the right is a handmade video camera that records onto audio tape based on the platform of the Fisher-Price Pixel Vision children's toy camera. Anyone here old enough to know what that is? It was a toy, it made video, and it was terrible. And that's a weather balloon, a Navy surplus weather balloon. So I would send these things up, and they never really worked very well, so I had to fake the aerial view. So that's a tabletop set and a high resolution camera. It's a Leica camera with 25 ISO film. And I made pictures that look kind of like this, except that this isn't a set that I built. This is what's it called? Railroad America? Roadside America in Pennsylvania, the largest HO model railroad layout, as is this. This model is not a model. This is the second generation Nadar 2000. a camera that actually worked. So I was sending up weather balloons with wireless video cameras that basically, they're handmade. I just ordered the components from B&H Photo in New York and hot glued everything together and would send them up. That got expensive, so I started to tether them to a fishing rod and reel. There's my daughter, who's now in college, playing in the sandbox back then. That's my neighbor asking me what I'm doing, pointing a fishing rod at the sky. And then I pointed to the balloon. They would occasionally pop and go away because this was a pretty rinky-dink operation. And I would get images from really high up before I lost the signal. It would just break up because it would lose the connection. But I always imagine that when they do come down, which they do, that it's like someone who's already a little paranoid, who starts stocking up on powdered milk and ammo. Like, they're watching me, I told you they're watching me. They're just not as sophisticated as we thought. This is a view of the exact same area from Google Earth from Saturday, from this past Saturday. And I point this out because check out those trees. Look at what we have here. What we have here is hundreds of photographs, digital photographs taken from the sky that are then mapped to a 3D armature, which, if you have any experience in game design, will sound a lot like game design, right? That's a virtual world. And this is sort of the reality that we experience when we look at Google Earth. And it's so wrong. It's such a visual abstraction. This is from a 2003 solo show that I had in Brooklyn at a no longer in existence gallery called Jack the Pelican Presents, which was a great old gallery. And like so many Williamsburg galleries in the 90s and the aughts, it disappeared. This was installed in the front room of the gallery on a cinder block wall that I thought looked kind of like a concrete bunker. This is real-time 24-hour surveillance of George Bush, Paul Wolfowitz, John Ashcroft, and Dick Cheney's residences, home addresses. How did I get that? Which was one of the questions the reviewer was stubborn about. The FAA accidentally announced protected airspace in Crawford, Texas in 2002. Google Earth didn't exist, so I took those coordinates and cross-referenced them with the Microsoft Terra server, which was basically just a relational database of USGS satellite imagery, which was, back in the day, was like film, 70mm film taken from the sky. And then they issued a retractment, that, oh no, never mind, it's not really. But there's nothing in Crawford to protect except maybe W's Ranch. I naively assumed that I could avoid prison if I don't just share that image, so I made a model of it and rephotographed it. So this is a 4x5 foot photograph, straight gelatin silver print made from a negative of a model based on that satellite image. And I was so excited about how well that worked and just the conceptual conceit that it contained that I made a lot of other work that way, where I would base a detailed or not so detailed model on a satellite image. This is the actual model. So in an adjacent room, after you see the video display, 24-hour surveillance, walk past a bunch of photographs, very large photographs, still images, into an adjoining room, this is a pretty big space, with these big balloons floating around the room in what's called negative buoyancy, which means they don't go up, they don't go down, they just kind of drift around like this. And those had cameras suspended above the models. So cardboard model, looks like that, and they were all kind of floating around. I had someone walk up to me at the opening and say, you know what you ought to do? You ought to have those cameras show in that other room. I was like, that's a great idea. That's exactly what was happening. This is I'm going to show you a few failures because I locate some poignancy and some meaning in massive failures as an artist. This was the most detailed model I ever made. It's of the CIA headquarters in Langley. The model was great, but it was too heavy for any space I was ever visible enough to command. It took way too many balloons, so it just filled the gallery, and you couldn't see anything. This was installed at Penn State, and the signal from the camera was piped into the TVs in the student union, which I'm sure was just very confusing. It had a nice movement, though. It would move really nice, but you couldn't really see it in the gallery. This one did work. This was at Van Brunt Gallery in Chelsea. This was actually, the video monitor was installed at the Gallerina's desk. So at the reception desk where there's the person that tells you can't use the bathroom, there's a little monitor there. And that's where this was. This is Madison Square Garden during the Republican National Convention in New York. Wanted to keep an eye on those guys. And this is the model. And terrible documentation, and this is hard to explain, but I want to try. This is an aerial view of the city that only exists as the video. In that, it's a terrible painting. I mean, I'm doing well to carve my name on a tree, much less make a painting. So, handmade camera with a fisheye lens, a very, very wide-angle lens that distorts space like this. Things in the center look really close, things at the edges look really far away. You've all seen that, right? That angular distortion that's built into a really wide-angle view. I painted the image of Madison Square Garden in the opposite direction so that it gets flat again in the pipe, in the wire going to the camera, going to the monitor. So only on the monitor is it flat again, and that view doesn't exist. It's kind of a long way around the block. So again, I decided to flip that lens back again onto myself after watching The Watchers, as someone described that work. I wanted to look back again on myself, but not actually on myself. I wanted to throw off the enemy, so this is a counterintelligence strategy now, a decoy project. This is 16 other Daniel Goodwins in America, live. It's a Halliburton briefcase and a mil-spec monitor. And these are the models. This is installed at our fabulous, beautiful Bohr sculpture studio that if you haven't had an opportunity to check out, I am hereby offering to give you a tour, as long as it's on a Tuesday. This got pretty complicated because I don't have a federal license to have that many competing RF signals. So they kind of like bled into each other and it was sort of a mess. But I'm taking advantage of some miniaturization so that now the heaviest thing about the model is the battery. And I actually had to put lead weights on them to achieve negative buoyancy because I had the opposite problem with these as with the CIA headquarters. And that's what they look like, sort of. But there's a room of 16 of them. And people would like play with them. You know, I mean, normally you walk into a museum or a gallery and I think it's sort of implied that you don't touch the art, right? That was my first job in New York City with security guard, and that's just all you do is go around telling people, stop touching that. There's the bathroom, don't touch that. That's all you do. But people would like bat them around, and then they'd put their hand under there and go, oh, look, look, look. You know. So this was at Albany International Airport, and this was a really exciting show. It was a lot of work because the TSA does not have much of a sense of humor. These were, I think, 16 other Daniel Goodwin homes suspended above the security area. So let that sink in for a second. They can't touch the ceiling because some bad alarm goes off. And I asked the TSA guy assigned to me what happens. He was like, you don't want to know. You don't want to know. They can't go down to the metal detectors. And in fact, they weren't convinced that those cameras couldn't see around the model. I mean, I showed them. I was like, it can only see that. It can't see anybody. And they were like, so they had me put dead batteries in them and fake the thing after all. It worked. I swear to God, it worked. But they said, no, no, you gotta not have cameras in here. No cameras. Even cameras that can't see what we're doing. So that's kind of what the video looked like. That's kind of what the models look like. They're pretty terrible. And that became really interesting to me, that it was all about finding that level of restraint in terms of description. How poorly can I describe the scene in the model and still have it look plausible to you as a real image? And it turns out they could be pretty bad. I mean, that's terrible, you know. But they end up looking convincing. This is not my work. This is just a nod to an artist who's very well known, James K. Sabir. I think of him as something of a mentor, even though I never studied under him. We taught together for a while at the Cooper Union, and I got to know him pretty well, and we're still pretty close, pretty good friends. But he may not realize what a huge influence he had on my work. Not because it looks the same, but because some of his strategies are similar. This is the set where he constructed this image, all based on actual places. But he tends to remove information more than add it. This is not a mentor. This is a very young artist named Hassan Elahi. I'm just going to show you a few people who are kind of, I feel like I'm in conversation with, but not in a linear way, right? Not in a chronological or linear way. In 2006, Hassan Elahi, turns out, has the same name as a bad guy who was hoarding explosives. And he was detained by the FBI and was given a permanent contact with the FBI because he flies constantly as an artist. He's all over the planet. And so he has to check in with this guy. So what he started doing was texting him images of the airport meals he was eating and of the bathrooms he was using, and launched a career as an artist, basically thanks to the FBI accidentally detaining him. This is Jill Majid, someone I've been on a few panels with, someone I respect a lot. She's done a lot of things, but this was the first thing that launched her career. She requested the closed-circuit television footage, because it's all recorded in London, turns out, that those things are, all of that footage is archived, but only for a certain amount of time. The tapes are erased after a few weeks unless someone requests through this very sort of bureaucratic process. So Jill made these requests for the tapes like love letters. She wrote to the central command of the London closed-circuit television surveillance system these love letters describing her feelings and her thoughts about the city. And it got weird because she actually somehow convinced the guys who sit in front of all the monitors, which turns out, by the way, that's just for when people visit. That's not, they don't sit and watch those monitors, right? They wait for something to be flagged and then they look at it, but it's an AI program that kind of like scans for stuff. The bank of video monitors is kind of a prop. But she was able to convince those guys to set up two-way radio communication with her as she walked through the streets of London blindfolded, and they kept her from dying. The video, I'm not going to show you the video, but it's astounding. It's astounding to watch her just walking through London and they're going, oh, no, stop, take a right, you know. Pretty amazing. This image that you can't see at all, which is perfect, is by Trevor Paglin. Paglin is a recent MacArthur Genius Grant recipient, asshole. And every panel I've ever been on with him, he's the keynote speaker, and he's a brilliant guy and everything. He has a level of access that those of us that sort of work in this area are envious of. He has a PhD in geography, and somehow he's able to attend all of these defense industry conferences. This is called Untitled Reaper Drone, and we're to believe that Trevor knows that there's a Reaper drone in the center, right there, of that image. These are recreated patches for black program military aircraft. We have to take his word for it. This is called The Other Night Sky. So no, each of these is a whole series, right? I'm just showing you one. This is called The Other Night Sky, and these are tracing the orbits of classified spy satellites. And this is an NSA listening station that he is part of a project that he called Limit Telephotography, where he's using astronomical optics and conventional cameras, visible light cameras. He did a whole thing of CIA extraordinary rendition sites that were all fuzzy and blurry. His new work's really fascinating too. He shows at Metro Pictures if you are motivated to check him out. Okay, so as I put this talk together, I realized how circular my practice is, and I'm sort of just embracing that. I'm like an ant. I kind of just keep following the same trail over and over. I decided to make some more things based on descriptions. This time not the CIA, this time I wanted to talk to people who had encountered failed or deactivated devices or who disarmed IEDs. And so these are all based on first-hand descriptions or news accounts of deactivated IEDs. So it's a failed pipe bomb on the left and Richard Reed's shoe bomb, sort of, on the right. I think of these as oddly poetic in that they're scary, and the conflicts that engendered them are scary and complex, but they're also kind of beautiful in that either some hero stopped this from killing everybody, or it's just stuck, never doing what it was designed to do, because it's bad, and it just has to sit there as a failure. Everybody remembers the underwear bomb. That's not what it looked like. The ruler is important here. The ruler is something that I keep going back to in work kind of cyclically as well. Just as a sort of photographic convention it's often used to establish just that extra little bit of authority, right? It has a scale, therefore it must be real. It was actually there. This is a deactivated suicide vest. Those are, by the way, these are all prints. That's smaller than the print actually is, the projection. These are very large prints. And what happens with this photograph was face mounted to plexiglass, which if you go to the museum right now, you can see a Jeff Wall photograph that's like, what is it, Chen, 9 feet by 12 feet? It's massive. And it's a process where they take the front of the print and laminate it to clear plexiglass. It's very, it's as difficult as it sounds. But what you achieve is this impossible flatness and this perfect sort of mirror surface that is like a window, right, that you can just look through at reality on the other side, which is what photographs are trying to get you to do anyway, and we fall for it over and over and over again. But this was done that way so that if you walked up to it and the lights in the gallery were just right, it would project, you would see your reflection wearing the vest. This is an artist, Taryn Simon. I'm not going to show you much of her work, but she's another one that's invoked often when we start talking about some of these ideas. Taryn was able to convince the TSA at JFK International to allow her to set up a makeshift photo studio right near where they confiscate contraband when people are either trying to get on a plane or arriving. So this is like a catalogic survey of all the crazy stuff people try to sneak onto planes. This is a recent project at Gagosian Gallery in New York City, where Taryn, working from black and white photographs and written accounts, recreated all of the floral table settings at the signings of some of the world's most important treaties and accords. And this is a really good example of how poorly a projected reproduction accurately represents the work. These are eye-popping, and you wouldn't think that 6-foot-tall photographs of floral arrangements would be a very compelling exhibition, especially if there's like 30 of them. But I looked at every single one of them for several moments, and I mean they're astounding photographs. Okay, how am I doing on time?
Doing good.
Okay. In 2012, I took a sabbatical and a shower, and said, I'm just not going to make bombs. I'm not going to make weapons. I'm not going to, because I started, there was a moment with the CIA project where I kind of started, I left the documentary sources and I started inventing stuff. And I looked up and realized, oh shit, I got good at this. I don't want to be good at this. I don't want to be good at imagining ways to hurt people. And the same thing kind of happened as I was studying these IEDs. I also noticed that the guys, mostly guys, who were talking to me and explaining what these things might look like were lying in a lot of cases because they didn't trust me and they probably should not. So they were intentionally giving me some misinformation because I would make the thing and then I'd exhibit it, and I had like a guy who was former Navy intelligence comes up and he goes like, that's completely wrong. That's not going to blow up. Like, they were lying. Good. Good. So for this sabbatical, I decided I'm just going to walk around with a camera near where my studio is. Maybe I'll make stuff in the studio, but I'm going to take a breather. And I'm just going to photograph things in the so-called real world because I've heard of it and I'm interested in looking into that. So this is the marginal spaces between developments in suburban Del Mar, where my studio is. And the grid lines that you see, it's basically an echo of the grid lines that you see on the back of the view camera. That gridded abstraction that you look at and through when you're composing an image like this. And now you can do that on your phone, which is a pretty cool development. You can impose a grid. So I was scratching that back in to kind of remind the viewer that this isn't really here. This is so thin and fragile. This is just silver gelatin emulsion sitting on plastic. And look, I could just scratch right through it. But also, I was finding grids out in the woods. I was observing this, structure. And I was also seeing this struggle, this weird struggle of invasive vines and bamboo trying to throttle these 200-year-old cherry and oak and pine trees, and then the looming threat of the developers that are going to probably mow this down to build ugly-ass McMansions, that were just scaled up in AutoCAD. And it was just somehow it charged that marginal space for me. So this is the kind of camera I'm walking around with. I later fitted this. This isn't the exact camera, but it was one like this. I fitted it with a modern lens, but it still works flawlessly. It's amazing. This is what it looks like in color. The color negative film, when you scratch through it, that wound is this beautiful amber color. And it looks like fire or rusted rebar or something, but it's an object right in front of you. Until you look closely and you realize, no, it's actually a wound. It's actually torn and ripped. It's a hole. But it's not any of those. It's a flat piece of paper, right? So, stumbling back into the studio to make a thing that doesn't blow up or doesn't look like it would blow up, I decided to start with the cherry tree that fell right by my studio and nearly knocked it down, which I was cutting and splitting. It was a sort of an aesthetic challenge to photograph the entire surface of the log and then wrap it back around and make my own log, 1-to-1 scale, because I hate myself. So this is the log on the right on a table with some grid lines scratched into the film. The woods from which it came and the tree that almost took out my studio is on the left. And that shape, that weird shape, that was purely serendipitous, that repetition. That's just where I got a little aggressive with the X-Acto knife and just ripped through the film. And I couldn't reproduce that if I wanted to. So back in the studio, I started kind of pulling that thread that that tugged on until all my clothing unraveled, and making everything around me, the sort of personal effects of image production. So this is called duct tape decoy, and it's not a roll of duct tape, and that's not really a sheet of graph paper. I mean, it is. It's blue lines on graph paper, but the graph paper is 9 feet wide, and the roll of duct tape is about that big. And that's only, maybe it's not interesting, but it's only interesting for me as a print. You only really encounter the level of description that the camera affords in the print. When you see one thing, you see a roll of duct tape sitting on graph paper. And then you see these problems, wait, what is that? And wait, why is that so weird? And wait, what's the plane? Where are we standing? And then there are little clues as to the scale that start to be teased out. And that's pretty delicious for me. That was something I wanted to repeat over and over again. So the details that describe the so-called actual image aren't that highly descriptive. The details that are really described with poke your eye out clarity are the problems, like the folds and the gaps. That's not a ruler, except it is. This is an object pretending to be a virtual object. Has anybody ever seen the 3D print file sharing community Thingiverse? This is an image from Thingiverse. If you wanted to print a roll of duct tape instead of buy one, a roll of duct tape that doesn't work, you could go to Thingiverse, and someone has made one, and you can download it for free, and you can, with an expensive 3D printer, make a print of it. But the environment is what interested me. The virtual environment where we've got this grid, and we've got this horizon line, and this sort of promise of, like, you know, this expansive space, and locating the thing that's important right in the middle. So for example, if you wanted to 3D print for 36 hours a folding ruler that you could buy at the hardware store for $7, MakerBot will hook you up. So this is the MakerBot production space, very similar to the Thingiverse space, and very similar to the space I was already quoting without realizing it when I constructed my grid sweep table. So I started making fake virtual 3D objects and environments. That's not a 3D printed screwdriver. That's a screwdriver dipped in rubber on a rod that pierces that background. So it's not that I have like some evangelical issue with Photoshop. I use Photoshop all the time. I just don't use it for certain tricks because I like for the print to reveal that some idiot actually did this, actually made this, when you could so easily just do it in Photoshop. In fact, that grid, that gray grid background is a direct reference to Photoshop. I didn't make this. This is a snow tire that's for sale if anyone's in the market on eBay. When you cut away the background or cut away anything in Photoshop to leave nothing, you don't really leave nothing, because if you cut it away to white, white is a thing. It has a numeric designation in the computer, right? Nothing is this gray. This is code for nothing. So you don't see that. You don't see that checkerboard pattern. It's not there. It's transparent. It's invisible. This is called invisible square on invisible rectangle. And this is called invisible duct tape. Sometimes when I say these things out loud, they sound really stupid. So again, that could have been a Photoshop trick, but it's actually paper glued to a real roll of duct tape with squares drawn on it, and a much larger squares on the background because it's about 6 feet in front of the background. That's the early moments of the production of that grid. This is called the color checker on invisible landscape. The Macbeth standard color checker is a photographer's sort of standard tool, especially if you shoot film. You include one sheet of film that you send to the lab that has the color chart right in there. And then you've got a physical thing you compare it to, and you can blame them for problems. It's never their fault, but you can try to blame them for problems with the color. And so I got the film back from the lab, and I saw that color checker, and I thought, that's the picture. But because I'm such a slave to my own rules, I had to draw it. I couldn't just use the color checker. So I had to go make a color checker, which I did on an airplane, and it was really fun to work on that for several hours. And I could tell that the woman sitting next to me wanted to ask me about it, but she also didn't want to talk to me. So finally she said, can I just ask what? Yeah. So I tell her what I'm doing, explain the whole thing, and I basically describe the whole picture, because that's, however, fortunately or unfortunately, that's kind of how I work. It can be stultifying sometimes. I pre-visualize a thing, and I go and I make it, and then I look at the film and I go, yeah, okay, next. So as I describe that to her, she says, her first thing she asks is, and people pay you for that? And I was like, no, not actually, not usually, every now and then, but I have to have this part-time job as a professor. This is a 4x6 sheet of pegboard, except it's a 4x6 photograph. And that's a close-up of the holes. So I moved on to these, this is more recent work. This is just from a year ago or so. These objects that are less recognizable as flotsam and jetsam from the studio, and maybe a little more architectural. And this is sort of like naive little optical tricks, right? So this is a sheet of mat board or museum board folded at a 45-degree angle facing you like that. And the grid is drawn on it. This is the trick I learned when I painted that terrible painting of Madison Square Garden with the distortion factored in. The distortion of the grid shape is such that it flattens out when it's at 45-degree angle, and it holds your head in just the right place. And it kind of works. And I actually like the problems. Like I said, I mean, that's one of the things that the camera can really describe is the things you don't even notice in real life. So this is an artist that I both love and hate. Really young Canadian artist named Jessica Eaton. Yet another artist who's making my work better than I am. No Photoshop. This is just a straight-up painted object. And these are amazing prints in person. This is by Sarah Vanderbeek. It's a former student of mine from Cooper Union. And I love saying that because she's so much more successful than I am. But it turns out now she's kind of doing some of the stuff that I'm interested in. She also shows at Metro Pictures and is a rock star. These are amazing. I knew they wouldn't reproduce well, but I want to show them anyway. They're kind of that hard to see in real life, too. You really got to work to make these out, and then they pay off. This is another young artist. Everybody seems like a young artist to me. This is Lucas Blaylock. Blaylock has taken all of those things that we photographers in Photoshop tend to hide, or at least, it's just commonly assumed that, like, you just kind of do that behind the scenes, right? These are just the things we do. We sharpen, we jack up contrast and saturation, and we do compositing and stuff. And he just takes all that and puts it right in the foreground. And that simple gesture of locating in a very clumsy way those tools, I think he gets a new strata of meaning in a way. So there's our grid, right? He very sloppily cut out, some drawing shapes from this object and left the grid. This one didn't really work. I'm not sure if this really works, but I show it just because it's another example of one of those sets that really requires the print. I'm not a print fetishist, but this image really only makes sense in a flat printed thing. As a projection, it looks too much like a window. You're looking through it at the thing on the other side. That set's about 6 feet deep, though, if that makes sense. This worked pretty well. Can you figure out what's happening here? This is two 45-degree angle cards, one stuck in front of the other to make that shape that's not real, and actually kind of paradoxical and confusing. This got used for the cover of a book by the brilliant philosopher Bradley Armorgarb, one of the world's foremost experts on logic and math and contradiction. Happens to teach at UAlbany, lucky us, for a collection of essays called Reflections on the Liar, which I just think is so, I can't imagine being on a better book cover. Unless somebody's writing a book about object-oriented ontology, this is available. Talk to my agent. That's a quote of this Ed Ruscha print, lithograph from the 70s called OO. There's my OO, and there's the Ed Ruscha OO, long before object-oriented ontology was a thing. This is the most recent. I started making these kind of like diagrammatic, really kind of flat-footed illustrations of paradoxical concepts, right? This is called Penrose triangle. It's a very famous, typically drawn illustration of contradiction or paradox. And I'm going to show you, because you're special and you came to this, how it works. Because you probably, are you wondering how it works?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Pay attention. Right? One more time. It's a real thing in the real world. It's just all about where you stand, all about where I force you to stand and keep you from moving. Along the lines of failure, this is a sheet of graph paper. It's blue ink on paper. This is the set for the graph paper. It's push pens and thread on cotton paper on plywood. There's my color checker, right? That's the real one, not the drawn one. This is the set in my studio in Del Mar where I made the graph paper. There's your grid. my beloved Sinar. And that's what it looks like up close. The idea here was to make an object that impersonates itself so completely that people don't notice. Problem was, when I showed it, no one noticed. No one gave a shit. No one even paused for a second. They were just like, huh, graph paper. And that's because I reproduced it. I printed it 8.5 by 11. Right? If you got this far away from it, you would see that, oh yeah, it's not graph paper. Who cares? So I think I'm going to make it big. I'm going to make a large print like on that scale and see if that's a thing. But before I trash the set, I made some other pictures, and this one I think kind of works. It's a little more interesting maybe. And again, this is not like a Photoshop deal. This is a 6 foot deep set. So the gauge of the string in the back is the same as in the front. And that's something you can't observe with your eyes. You can't make that happen physically when you look at the thing. It only works for a camera, right? I know that's one of the simplest aspects of photography, but it's still the thing that kind of keeps me going, of basically making the invisible visible, right? Okay, so I'm going to talk about some work that I can't show you. Ed's going to keep me honest because he's sitting right there. This is an ongoing project, so while I've been doing all that other stuff, I've also been working on this project that we are calling, Ed Schwarzschild and I are calling Homeland Security, Words and Pictures. So it's a couple of years into it now, and it's got several years yet to go. Our project is essentially talking to people at a range of levels in the security industrial complex. We're having in-depth in-person interviews with students, with policymakers, with operatives, with former operatives, lots and lots of folks. We're not looking for any kind of privileged or classified information. Quite the contrary. We just want to know what's it like to do that job. Why did you want to do it? Why do you want to go into that field? And then I'm dealing with the aesthetic problem of how do I make this visual, all this stuff that is so secretive. This is not a photograph of Ed. This is a guy in a TSA uniform. So lots of hotel rooms, lots of crappy breakfast buffets, and lots of conversations. One of the things that I'm finding interesting about talking to folks is that, and we allow them to tell us where they want to be interviewed. So this guy wanted to be interviewed at Arlington Memorial, so we went there to talk to him. It seems like the higher up the personnel are in this world, the less concerned they are with the tape recorder or the camera, except that they're more concerned about the camera. And I think that's interesting. And I'm going to quote Teju Cole here. In this essay against neutrality, he writes that, what does he say? He says, all too often in our media, the words take us all the way there, but the photographs, habituated to a certain safety, hold back. And he goes on to quote Bertolt Brecht from 1931. He says, the camera is just as capable of lying as the typewriter. And it seems in the case of senior intelligence community professionals, their squeamishness is more with the camera than with the words, for sure. So this gentleman that I'm not going to talk about has a lengthy and classified resume, and it offers snapshots of some of the world's most complicated and violent struggles. He's now sort of an academic, teaching bad guys, or teaching good guys how to catch bad guys, I guess is a terminology that they would use. So remember the suppressed semi-automatic pistol from the CIA project. This is an attempt at a stand-in portrait. This is called Pablo's suppressed Glock 45 from 2018. So 25 years later, suppressed auto pistol finds its way back, no briefcase, and I'm adhering to my own rules here in that I'm photographing the surface of the thing and then making a cardboard cutout of the thing and putting that in my studio and photographing that. So there is at least these levels of remove. I'm not exactly sure what that means. I'm certain that it means something. probably about me psychologically, and we're about to get to that. This is called Pablo's Rolexes. This fellow has a habit of wearing 2 identical Rolexes, one on each wrist, one that works and one that doesn't. The one that doesn't was taken from a colleague who was killed in combat. So twice a day they're in sync, and his friend is remembered. This is a reference to Felix Gonzalez Torres' piece called Perfect Lovers from 1987. He set up 2 identical clocks and synchronized them, knowing that the batteries would run out asynchronously and that one would die before the other. And he did this piece when his lover was dying of AIDS. This is an SAR badge, which is short for Special Access Required, which is the security clearance above top secret. This is my dad, and this might circle back to the very beginning of some of the work I did, even of the CIA stuff. This is from the Tonopah test range in the Nevada desert when my dad worked on the Black Project that it became to be known as the Stealth Fighter. My dad is one of our interviewees, as is eventually Ed's dad, because both of our dads had these jobs that we couldn't know about, or we didn't know about it. We weren't sure exactly what they did, but we knew it was important, and maybe they were saving the world. So over the last 52 years, I knew precious little about what my dad actually did. And yet in interviewing him, now that all of these programs are no longer classified, I learned a lot. He has some stories. So in 1965, the year I was born, a professional photographer with a special access required security clearance set up a studio in Dallas, Texas to photograph multi-million-dollar prototype electro-optics that were going to be deployed to basically put an early end to the Vietnam War because our guys could see at night. This was cutting edge, super double top secret black program stuff. So I thought, it's appropriate for me to take those images, print them out, recreate them as cardboard cutouts, reverse engineer the lighting setup. I actually got the exact same color of seamless paper because they still make the same color, turns out. So this is the first generation FLIR, which is the forward-looking infrared, which my dad not invented, but was the program manager for. And his client was the CIA, turns out. I never knew that until recently. He never knew that until he was a couple of years into the project. So, I mean, I'm going to end here, I promise. But I feel like, this project, I don't really know if it's good yet. And the reason I'm sharing it with you, you're the first people to see this, other than Ed. I have to I always tell my students, you just got to trust the process, you got to make the thing and then figure out what it means. I never take that advice. I almost never actually work that way. I always try to see around the corner and make sure I'm not investing too much time in this. I want to just make sure it's conceptually airtight before I actually make it. This time, not so much. This time I'm trusting Ed and I'm trusting my ideas and I'm trusting sort of the largeness of this issue. And we're just gonna keep going. We're gonna keep talking to people, keep making photographs of them and their stuff. I mean, making portraits of human beings is a whole new thing for me. And I'm not showing you any of those because I can't, but eventually it'll turn up in a book or an exhibition or both. And so it was Oscar Wilde who said, and a colleague only recently reminded me of this, that art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. And I think that's a good thing to bear in mind, but not as a warning. I think it's something to bear in mind as a charge, right? Peril, okay, let's take on some peril. Let's go beneath the surface. But I don't, at least in my work visually, reminding you of the surface is how we're going to get there, because it's not the photograph that's going to go there. It's the viewer, right? It's the conversation. So, thanks.